What is up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Intellectual Gaming, where gaming equals education. I'm your host, Jason, the video game scholar, and for today's episode, I just kind of wanted to talk a bit about what is probably one of the more prominent examples that people think of when they think of education tied with video games or studying video games, and that would be Bioshock, which is an absolutely phenomenal game. If you have not played it yet, I would definitely highly recommend it. It's one of the most highly praised video games that's ever been created. It was released back in 2007, if you can believe it or not, by 2K. And wow, that is just such a long time ago to really think about. And I do want to preface before we get any further that this is going to contain spoilers for the game. So if you don't want to get spoiled for the first Bioshock, if you haven't played it yet, definitely wait to listen to this until after you have. Or if you just don't care about the spoilers, I guess you can listen to it. Although I definitely highly recommend you go ahead and play it, because I don't think will be disappointed. You do have to like first-person shooters, though. And kind of more darker, creepier games. It is usually styled as a horror game. I don't think it's truly that terrifying, but it definitely is creepy. And so, yeah, if you don't like that kind of stuff, be forewarned. But kind of moving into what exactly it's about. And the primary themes that Bioshock explores are those surrounding the political and you could almost say economical, but it's really more of a political moral philosophy of objectivism. So objectivism is a philosophy that was developed by Ayn Rand, who was an economist and philosopher who grew up in Russia during the Soviet Union days, during the Cold War, and ended up leaving and coming to America, having a very negative view of socialism, communism, and that whole economic, political style. So instead, she kind of ended swinging the other way and became very much a sort of an ultra-capitalist. She viewed what she would argue as like communist ideals, the big one being collectivism, the idea that the community or the state is more important than you as the individual. She considered that to be an absolute horrible mentality. To her, she viewed that you, as yourself, are what should be most important to you. Your values are what matters. Your life is what matters. Your happiness is what matters. And that should trump any sort of state or, communal mentality. You shouldn't be giving up your rights to the state or to the community. You shouldn't be giving up your happiness for anyone else. Ayn Rand very much believed that the reason you are on this planet essentially is to be happy. And your happiness should be your own goals, and you shouldn't sacrifice that happiness for anything, because what's the point in living if you're giving that up, your happiness, or if you're not pursuing your own happiness? So she, when she started really developing these views, she developed them into this philosophy which she called objectivism. And she called it objectivism because its core principle was the idea that morality does not have any grays. There are no moral grays at all. Every action is either a good action or a bad action. And it, in a lot of ways, like, her definition of a good action was increasing your own happiness. And she used that to develop her own system, or her own mentality of where rights are derived from. And to her, a core, and this is something that I feel like some people maybe lose when studying Ayn Rand, a core part of her philosophy was that you should not be infringing on the happiness of anyone else, just like they should not be infringing on your happiness. Ayn Rand would argue still that stealing was not okay. Murder is not okay. Things like that. But every action and reaction, it does have a clear moral good and moral bad. Anything you do is either a good or a bad. So to her, it was all objective. And you can see this echoed very much in her works. She wrote a couple of really well-known novels. The Fountainhead is one, and then her most well-known was Atlas Shrugged, where she basically took her entire philosophy and wrote Atlas Shrugged at espousing it, essentially. The whole purpose of Atlas Shrugged is to explain her views on economics, her views on politics, her views on morality, and convey it in actual fiction, and also showcase how she thought the world would look like if all the producers went away. A big argument of Rand's was that the producers were the people who were being villainized. She thought that people were against the wealthy, against the business owners, against the corporate, what would be the corporate elite, I guess, of today's day and age. And her argument was that they were the producers of the nation. They were the people who kept things going. And we should be celebrating them, not criticizing them, not trying to take their money, not trying to knock them down to a lower level. We should be celebrating what they produce and what they give to the country. And Atlas Shrugged in particular really is about that sort of concept. And those concepts were then taken, and just as they were translated in a bit of a more positive light in Atlas Shrugged, here they are translated a little bit more negatively, where these philosophies that were pulled from Ayn Rand and utilized in the City of Rapture, where the game takes place, ultimately directly lead to the fall of Rapture and the complete degradation of the entire society there. It's more or less a mirror or an echo of Atlas Shrugged. In Atlas Shrugged, you have John Galt taking people away to his city, his building, his paradise, and that's how it's shown, is a paradise. He takes these producers, he takes these hard workers, gathers them together, and they create something amazing, while the rest of the country kind of crumbles around them. Whereas you look at Bioshock, and you have Andrew Ryan, who's the person who creates the City of Rapture, and he pretty much does the same thing. He gathers people into his city to create this city based around the exact same ideals as you see in Atlas Shrugged. These ideals of objectivism, these ideas that you as the individual are always the priority, that everything you produce belongs to you, that it is the individual first, above the community, above the state, above the society, that there are moral absolutes, there are no moral gray areas, etc. Only what you see in Bioshock is kind of the inverse. You see the cities just sort of crumble and bend and break around itself because of the policies being put into place. Though it is important to note that the lead developer on the project, Ken Levine, said that the purpose of the game was not to be a straight critique of objectivism. The point that he was trying to make was about humanity itself. It's an exploration of humanity. So you can take, what happens in Atlas Shrugged and what happens here as two sides of almost the same coin, but it doesn't necessarily negate one or the other, because this is more of an examination of how humanity sort of reacted to these policies. And you can agree that this is maybe how this would turn out, and maybe you disagree. And that would be a good discussion for the comments, or feel free to contact me directly. I'd be more than happy to talk about it more in depth with anyone. But Bioshock does certainly provide an interesting examination into humanity as a whole, and when it comes to objectivist values, the game does a very good job of expressing it. You can see that pretty much right from the very beginning. The game more or less starts with you heading to this lighthouse, where there's the storm going around and things are crazy, and you're there because of a plane crash. And later games will kind of elaborate more on this plane crash, and you even find more about it as you go through this game. But Bioshock Infinite ends up expounding on it even more, to a degree that some love and some hate, but we'll talk about that probably another day. But anyway, I digress here. You go into this lighthouse, and it turns out to be an entrance to an elevator, which takes you down to the city of Rapture. And as you go down that elevator, there is a speaker system which plays this opening speech by Andrew Ryan to welcome all newcomers into his city. So I will go ahead and play the speech here. Hopefully I don't get any sort of strike or anything. I don't think I should. But I think this is really good at sort of showing the theme of Bioshock, but also showing how much Bioshock expresses these Ayn Rand derived objectivist values that the intention was to explore. So here is Andrew Ryan at the start of the game.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose rapture.
So from there, it kind of goes into this really cool view of the city for the first time, which is just really kind of incredible to see. There is a reason why Bioshock is usually used as an example when people are arguing that video games should be considered an art form, because it certainly is an incredibly artistic game. And hopefully you guys were all able to hear that. If you couldn't hear that, go and Google it. You can find the video on YouTube pretty easily. That's just where I pulled that up. And it will give you a really good context for the game, and what exactly those themes are. Although hopefully you've all heard it before, because hopefully most of you guys have played it by now. Because, like I said, it is truly a unique experience of a game. But anyway, the speaker you heard there, Andrew Ryan, those of you who have looked at his name spelled out and everything might have noticed that it's actually a version of Ayn Rand. It's a name that is meant to be derived from it. Later you'll meet a character named Atlas, and again, another reference to Atlas Shrugged. But like I pointed out, this game is essentially an inversion of Atlas Shrugged. You have this society that was created on the same principles, but things worked out very differently. You have Andrew Ryan, who is an inversion of John Galt, essentially. Someone who did the exact same thing, got dissatisfied with the way the world was, gathered people to create his own city away from everything where he could fully implement his own vision, except rather than creating a paradise, as John Galt is portrayed as having done, Andrew Ryan sort of created a system that basically just fell apart. And to just kind of go into a little bit about Rapture, you can find a lot of this information as you go through the game, as the story unfolds, and there's been little bits of backstory kind of released around it to kind of explain a little bit more about exactly what happened. Some of you also find out in the game Bioshock Infinite, where the DLC entirely takes place in the city of Rapture. But Rapture was created, again, with the mindset of 100% laissez-faire economics. Everything was privately owned, including the police departments. schools, fire departments. This ultimately, in the City of Rapture, began to create a rift between the wealthy and the poorer people. And the poor ultimately started having less and less with which in order to be able to survive, essentially, because the divide between the wealthy and the not wealthy in the city was just becoming too great. That's when Dr. Tenenbaum discovers this substance called Adam. So Adam is a substance that could literally alter your genetic code, allowing kind of like a next evolution of humanity, essentially. It could give you specific abilities, it could make you stronger. It changed you based on your own desires, essentially. And because of the economic system that was set up in Rapture, which is based purely on private ownership without any sort of government intervention whatsoever, no oversight, basically the both the development, the testing, as well as the distribution of Adam, which they would distribute to people through things called plasmids. None of that was regulated. They could just kind of do whatever they want. So they didn't really do a lot of testing or anything. They just started mass distributing to the public. And it turned out to be a very highly addicted substance. And once you were addicted to it, if you didn't receive a steady enough supply of Adam, then you would go insane. The withdrawal would literally break your brain and you would go crazy. And it would start to degrade your body. So that's when one of the characters you meet a little bit later in the game, Frank Fontaine, used the opportunity to begin smuggling Adam. And he began to create the smuggling empire and began to start to rival Andrew Ryan in power. So you start to have this shift in Rapture even more, that's creating an even bigger divide. Not just the wealthy and the poor, but between Andrew Ryan and his enforcement system, basically. And then you have Frank Fontaine and the power he is amassing. Ryan tries to have Fontaine arrested, and Fontaine basically is like, no, that's not happening. So he resists. And that leads to this big battle where, at the end of it, Fontaine is apparently killed, although they weren't ever able to recover a body. Fontaine had used the cover in order to be able to fake his death, and that's when he comes and uses his alias Atlas, which, as I said before, obviously a reference to Atlas Shrugged. And then he began basically trying to stir up unrest throughout the City of Rapture. He basically made it his priority to just make things as hard for Andrew Ryan as possible so he could topple the whole system. This ultimately started creating mass unrest, which ultimately broke out into a civil war between Ryan and Atlas, and the entire city ended up, Ryan ended up exhibiting more and more authoritarian measures in order to try to maintain control of the city, and ultimately the mix of the authoritarian measures causing way more people to turn against Ryan and join Fontaine ended up resulting in a massive civil war which completely broke the entire city and completely collapsed it. That's basically the state the city is in when you, the player, began actually going through it. Is this broken, destroyed, rundown city where Ryan and Atlas are still alive, and they are still fighting each other, and they are still both trying to maintain control of the city, but there's not much of a city left, because it sort of breaks down. A lot of the people who are there start to run out of their supply of Adam, and they cannot keep a steady supply, so they all start going insane, and their body starts degrading, and those are the main enemies that you fight throughout the game, are the citizens who have now gone crazy, and basically just have no control over themselves anymore. So it's kind of sad. But you can see the kind of how the sort of ultimate laissez-faire, zero regulation economic system promoted by Ayn Rand started to promote the degradation of the city because a very dangerous, very addictive substance was just mass released to the public without any sort of regulation or testing whatsoever, which ultimately caused the downfall of the city. You also have Andrew Ryan, who started off as very much a laissez-faire, no regulation kind of person, who then becomes an authoritarian figure, literally locking down the city and trying to maintain a stranglehold over the city when things start turning against him. So it's definitely a very interesting exploration of Ayn Rand and her system. It perhaps maybe oversimplifies her views a little bit, and I think you'll find a lot of people who talk about Ayn Rand, especially those who very much do not like her system, will tend to oversimplify her arguments and her words and what exactly it was she was promoting. I will leave it up to you guys to study her yourself and come to your conclusion as to what you think of her. And I think that's always important, is don't listen to what other people are saying about these people. Read and study them yourself. Always make sure you verify your sources and actually check out what people are saying, because, a lot of, everyone has an agenda and everyone has a bias. So you read someone and you don't like what they say, chances are, if you're talking about it, it's going to be in a very negative light. So it's always good to come to your own conclusions, and remember that everybody, including me, has a bias. And if they tell you they don't have a bias, they're either lying or they have no clue what they're talking about, because everyone is biased. But yeah, the Bioshock series as a whole will continue this. The next 2 games in the series, and so far the only 2 games in the series, continue exploring different political themes. The second game actually goes to the opposite end of the spectrum and begins to study collectivism. Kind of the exact system that Ayn Rand was so vehement against. And it explores this sort of opposite idea of, okay, well, putting the collective group in charge. And, more regulation, things like that is better, because more regulation is better for the society, and the society is who we place first. And then the third game, Bioshock Infinite, deals a lot more with American exceptionalism, this kind of idea where America as a whole is inherently better than everything else, and you could almost say it was divinely created, and it explores themes of people who literally believe that. So yeah, I'll probably talk about both those games separately. They both deserve their own episodes, I would say, just because there is going to be a bit to talk about in both of those. But yeah, in terms of Bioshock, it's not super in-depth, and there's way more you could get into with, there's definitely way more references to Ayn Rand and her books. And there's references to books that are not just Atlas Shrugged as well in there. I just wanted to kind of give a brief sort of overview as to what happened to the City of Rapture and how its policies led to its collapse, and how those policies tie into the sort of policies and beliefs that Ayn Rand herself was promoting. Hopefully you guys will go and read up on some of her works, herself, and, see what she was saying, come to your own conclusions as to what you agree with, what you don't agree with. And yeah, happy studying, and we will see you all next time.